Welcome to the Filipino martial arts of Eskrima, also known as Arnez, Arnez de Mano, and Kale. The Philippine martial arts, one thing that keeps them all in common is, number one, is that they all teach with a bladed weapon, sticks, and the empty hands. Many of the martial arts in the Philippines derive from the type of weapon found within a province or a locale within the Philippines. Within the southern Philippines, they would have heavier type weapons, so they would be using heavier strokes. In some places, because of the type of weapon, agricultural knives, they might use a different way of using it. Some would use heavy chops, others light. Now, the safety factor within all the martial arts is that they normally will start you out with a stick. Even though they're teaching you as a bladed weapon, they will be working with a stick and using the strokes basically as an edge weapon. Now, just to give you an example of some of the knives used within the Philippines, you have what is known as the butterfly knife. Knives like this would normally be used within the cities. Many of the Filipinos would carry these for self-defense. Later on, they teach actually how to use these for self-defense purposes. So more or less, this would be called a street knife. Another weapon is known as the dagger. The dagger itself would be, again, mainly used by Filipinos that are, again, in cities or in built-up areas where they don't carry large weapons. The dagger is normally a double-edged weapon where you can be used for slashing and thrusting. To show you the difference between two knives, here we have two choppers. One is basically an agricultural knife that is basically used for chopping. The other one is the same type of knife that has a sharp edge on it, or a sharp point, which can now not only be used for chopping, but it can be used for thrusting. A system that basically uses a knife like this would be usually a chopping type system. A system like this would be chopping and thrusting. Now, the way blades are put on a knife also can mean the difference in how the system is used. This blade right here is wedged in. As you look into the handle, it is done no more than by wedging it into a piece of wood, which is the handle. They normally put blood, and what happens is the blood coagulates, and then the knife is just wedged in there as a form of glue. A weapon system like this would not be using centrifugal force, in other words, circling motions or anything like this, because you might lose the blade. Other weapons that are made strictly for war would be something like this, copied after the Moro Kris. This type of weapon now, the tang goes all the way through the handle and it's bolted on the end. This type of blade is very hard to lose. So one good thing about this thing is now you can use circular motions. So systems that have knives like this would have more intricate patterns, in other words, called the umbrella system, where you just swing the blade, turn it around. This type of weapon is outstanding because it is made strictly for war. We have a point where we can thrust. We have two cutting edges so I don't have to turn the hand. Weapons that, or systems that use something like this would probably prefer what is called the fan system, where the blade can just go up and down, and no matter how we hit them, we can cut them. Another weapon is an agricultural tool, again, made a little bit longer. This is a very heavy bolo. Bolo is nothing but the Spanish word for long knife. This one here is an agricultural weapon, and so if we used it, it's mainly used for cutting through jungles and so forth, but the good thing about this is it can be used for combat. It does have a point. Since the blade is heavy, you're not going to be able to use light strokes. Something like this, you would use heavy strokes. So systems that teach with a blade like this, which is heavy, would want to use very heavy chopping strokes. So that this tells the difference between different styles again. This is a war bolo. This one here is now similar to the other one, except this is made for war. It has a guard to help protect the hand. It has a sharper point. This type of weapon can now be used just like the double edge. It's sharp enough where now backstrokes without turning the handle can be done. In the southern Philippines, with the Muslims, the Moros, The Moros have what they call a kris. This weapon here is strictly for fighting. It's a modification of the Malayan kris, the Indonesian kris, except this is designed for heavy strikes. This is a beautiful weapon, it is strong, and it can sever a man's arm. Systems that use something like this, again, will not have to turn the blade each time they wanted to. And they can just go with heavy strokes, or they can even go with light slashes because of the sharpness of the blade. This is a Filipino tabalang. It's a fighting knife used mainly by the Christian Filipinos in northern Luzon. It's an outstanding fighting knife. It has an outstanding curve to it. Types of blades like this, where the curve is, make a better cut. So systems that use this would probably be using a draw cut. A draw cut is where you can slice and bring the blade across your opponent without having any chance of it sticking into your opponent's bones. It has a nice sharp point where it can be used for thrusting. Since it's a smaller knife, they can make smaller intricate patterns with this type of blade. Some of the tribes in the Philippines have a heavy blade known as a kampalang. This type of weapon is very strong. Tribes in certain parts of the Philippines still use shields. When we have weapons like this, they are made to directly chop through your opponent's shield, and so they're very heavy toward the front. Now, this weapon here is wedged in again. We wouldn't want to be making circular motions because we might lose our blade. So weapons like this would be used with heavy heavy strokes, striking at your opponent. These are again bolos. Bolo again just designates long knife. The tang is bolted at the rear. Knives like this are excellent for the intricate patterns used in certain eskrima systems. Now, it is unlikely that in the Philippines a person would carry two bolos of this size. Mainly today, it is taught modern so that you can use both hands equally. And today now, as you advance, you first learn with a single blade, then later graduate to a double blade. In tape 1, we will be concentrating basically with a stick. In tape 2, we'll teach you with the double sticks. In tape 3, we will teach you with double swords and sword and dagger. These are outstanding blades because, again, they are made with a point for thrusting, slashing. The false edge is outstanding for a backstroke, similar to the bowie knife. This is a Moro weapon again. Again, it is wedged inside the handle. This is one of the best chopping knives in existence, similar to the kukri of Nepal, of the Gurkhas. This thing has one advantage. It has a point and it can be used for a thrust. Some of the Moros would sharpen the back of the blade so that they could come back with a backstroke. But this type of blade is outstanding. It's a heavy chopping knife. Something like this, you would chop through any part of your opponent. His arm, if he put his hand out there to stop the blow or anything like this, which we'll teach you later, he would just sever the arm right off. In other words, here we no longer worry about where we strike anywhere and we just lob it off. So systems like this would be using and emphasizing heavy chops. Other knives are strictly used for special purposes. This one here is a Moro beheading knife. And so we won't go into that, but it just gives you an idea. Something like this is used two hands, and there is no system for that except other than just brute force on the back of somebody's neck. Simple as that. Now, in eskrima is the Spanish word for fencing. In other words, it's two people engaged in a scrimmage. So the scrimmage is basically with blades. In other words, fencing, sword fighting. So what we'll emphasize here in eskrima, since we use the name eskrima, is the blade. But in the Philippines, the stick is also used. In the past, many Filipinos would use sticks that were pointed. They would fire harden them. In other words, they'd stick them in the fire, they'd fire harden them. put a point on them, and then they could fight with these things. But that was at one time when they had very little metal. And so fighting arts with the stick became known. Many systems today that call their system arnés or arnés de mano prefer the stick. The stick is just as deadly as the blade. In other words, Magellan supposedly was killed by someone, Lapu-Lapu, who was the first patriot of the Philippines, who was supposed to kill him with, some say with a bladed weapon, others say with a pointed stick. And so this is where arnés de mano came from. Now, we will teach also with the stick, but the emphasis will be as a cutting weapon. When I use a stick, we will be using it as strokes. In other words, where I would teach you to strike or slash, I would teach you to strike or slash with the stick. So the emphasis will always be as a strike with a blade. Now, to give you the difference on this, in other words, if I was to use this on an opponent, if I was to use a blade, I would not have to use as much force. I could just let the force of the blade, takes very little force to slash through your opponent. And I would just cut with any part of the blade. Since it's sharp, razor sharp, I can go anywhere. I can even hold it against you and just draw slightly and you would be cut. With a stick, it wouldn't do any good. If I came with this part and then tried to pull any of these techniques, nothing would happen. So with the stick, our emphasis is going to be with striking basically with the tip. In other words, now when I make a strike, I would be going for bony areas. Or I would go to the throat, places that can't be protected. Or I would be going to the wrist, where their bone is, or to the elbow, or to the shin, or the knee. Of course, naturally, we can go to the soft spots, the soft areas, such as the groin. But notice how I will always turn my hand. Even when I come up for the groin, I will turn it, as if I had a blade. The same thing. Now, it's true, because we just told you, depending on the system, if I had a double-edged blade, I would not have to turn. I would just have to just bring it straight up and down. If the blade is heavy like this, it wouldn't make any difference. So again, I wouldn't have to turn. But a good idea is to try and turn each time we strike, putting the cutting edge towards your opponent. Again, when we teach you with a stick, it's mainly for safety purposes. So when we give you a stick, we teach you that you're making slashes. Now, when you're actually armed with a stick, then you have to know the difference. In other words, we now have to make our attacks basically with the tip. Now we can block with the shaft the same as we can with the blade.